Companies operating in today's global economy really need to get an understanding of the international geopolitical risk landscape. At Infortal Worldwide, we work with our clients on solving risk before it starts. Welcome to the Riskology podcast, where we're looking at managing business risk globally and really understanding the geopolitical risk landscape.
Welcome to the next episode of Riskology by Infortal, where we examine the world of geopolitics, economics, finance, and risk, and really looking at anything that can impact your business here in the United States or abroad. So today we've got an interesting topic, and this comes on the heels of our recent published article called Risk on the Rocks, the Geopolitics of Critical Minerals. And big shout out to Corporate Compliance Insights for publishing a number of our articles, but this one most recently. And we thought we would dive a little bit deeper into the topic today because it seems to be hitting the headlines pretty frequently. And there's a lot of money that's recently been pledged here in the United States to try and increase capacity for getting access to these critical or rare earth minerals. So let's dive into it. Ian, how's it going?
How are you, Chris? Things are going great. A little rocky. We need rare earth elements and we don't have enough of them.
That's right. And so far, it seems like China's the dominant player, which, we've had a bunch of conversations about different topics, of course, over the course of the series. But again, China is really dominating, and it's definitely strategic on their part. So, what can we do? As I mentioned, there's been a lot of money that's pledged. I think the Department of Energy recently pledged something like $72 billion available to sort of help facilitate mining. And then the Department of Defense, of course, because their technology and a lot of the emerging warfighting technology is really dependent on these critical minerals. They've pledged a lot of support for expanding operations here in the U.S., but it still seems pretty limited. What do you think sort of are the next steps?
Well, the U.S. has a lot of catching up to do. So we talk about China having sort of a head start on this and kind of a monopoly. And one of the reasons that is because China's been working on this since the late 90s. They've been very astute in looking at the future of technologies and seeking to basically control the raw materials needed for these advanced technologies. So the U.S. has a lot of catching up to do. China has become incredibly dominant in rare earth elements overall because it had the foresight to see new technologies emerging, kind of going back to the 1990s. They were looking ahead at, just the earliest stages of robotics, cybernetics, things like that. And they wanted to control the raw materials needed to basically produce these technologies. So we need to talk about what rare earth elements are, or REEs. But basically, these are a set of minerals that are deemed critical by the American Geosciences Institute because they're minerals that are basically essential to the economy. And they're very vulnerable to disruption, but they're valuable to multiple technologies. So these are metals that you probably haven't heard of. They're not household names like lithium, terbium, scandium, europium, promethium. These are all metals that are used in everything from guided missiles to pacemakers, uranium fission. If you're interested in going to Mars or SpaceX or new artificial intelligence, quantum computing, all of these things are kind of reliant on rare earth elements. So if you're thinking about the new industrial revolution, they're kind of critical to that. So in terms of like global trade, it's gone up just exponentially over the course of years. And it's involved.
Isn't it? It's something like 378 billion or so that the World Trade Organization estimated, I think, in overall trade.
Yeah, and you might even be listening to this podcast on like an iPhone or something like that. It uses REEs. You're probably not even aware of how integral this is to your life, but it is. And it's kind of the new thing after oil.
Yeah, great segue there in terms of thinking about this in the context of oil and gas, because in the 20th century, there was a huge focus, obviously, on fossil fuels. There still is. There still will be for some time in the future. But rare earth minerals really are starting to jump into the number 2 spot just based on the amount of technology, the sophistication of technology that really surrounds us everywhere. As you mentioned, a lot of the listeners probably have an iPhone or maybe an Android that has rare earth minerals in it.
Yeah.
Walk into a hospital, similar situation. Pretty much everything around you is going to be based on, or the technology will be based on rare earth minerals.
Yeah. So this is a point that nobody ever talks about, is the fact that even with high tech, everyone's like, we're in a post-industrial age and we're all high tech now. Well, not quite. All that technology actually has to rely on an industrial capacity just for the minerals and the components needed to make that technology feasible. So I don't care how high tech you want to get, unless you're talking about like metaphysical transcendence. You're going to need actual raw materials to make this technology happen.
And
So
now that there's AI, it'll be supercharged. The development of not only technology, but how different technology can interact with each other. It's going to really change fast in the next few years.
oh, yeah. And to highlight how this connects to sort of what's going on now, you see the war in Ukraine, you see what's going on in the Middle East, you see the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor that's kind of now clashing, if you notice, between powers that are aligned with the US, India, Israel, the Gulf states, and Europe versus China, Russia, Iran. This ties right into this because China controls the majority, and just to kind of break this down of how much REE they actually control, China produces 60% of the Earth's rare earth elements while processing 90%.
That's
So that
staggering. That's just wild. 90% in terms of processing. And if you look at what's happening here in the US, it's the complete opposite.
Yeah, and we've deindustrialized in this sense without really investing in requisite things like reclamation in terms of getting recycled components out. We haven't tapped into our own reserves in terms of natural resources to get access to some of these, even though the US has a fair amount of this, Canada does as well. We don't really do that because of a whole host of things, either because, we're sitting pretty economically, which, all the data says that we're not, especially for the new sort of era that we're looking at. You have environmental regulations that are in the way, and just we haven't developed the requisite capacity to sort of seriously harness American.
We're really starting at the bottom. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of funds that are opening up, and you've got the DoD amongst other organizations in the government that are pushing for having these domestic resources, because there is that concern when we start thinking about the trade wars and, God forbid, a hot war with China. Access to these resources could be halted very quickly. And that puts not only the US in a bad spot, but across the globe, they're all dependent on this same source. And so another thing that we're seeing, and we've mentioned this in our article as well, is the US is also starting to reach out to other regions to start developing potential partnerships for even other sources of these resources. There's critical or crucial deposits in South America. Africa is another place that has resources. And of course, once you leave the United States, that brings in a whole host of issues in terms of not only geopolitical risk, but think about social welfare, humanitarian issues. Those all come into play. So this is a very complicated space to operate within.
Yeah, and to even drive that home farther, if you look at Africa, there's some parallels now between what's going on between all these major powers trying to get rare earth elements from Africa. And in the past, there was a scramble for Africa in the 19th century, primarily, a little bit before that as well, between major European powers. And what they were doing was building railways, competing to build infrastructure so they could access those raw materials. It's happening again. And it's China, it's India, it's Russia, it's the US, it's new players, but it's the same game. And Africa is going to be right in the middle of it. It already is. If you look at the parallels between now and World War I, you see many of them, which should alarm anybody. There's this idea, there's a fallacy among many of those who don't see China as a threat, China does, or those that are optimistic about bilateral economic ties. Economic integration doesn't actually preclude war. None of the data actually shows that. That's based on a theory that doesn't actually pan out empirically. The economies in Europe before World War I were actually incredibly integrated with each other, independent, but that did not stop conflict from spiraling into a world war. So if you think about this from a geopolitical risk standpoint, at the macro level, of course, you have micro geopolitical risk at the country level, and even within specific firms, ranging from humanitarian issues to human rights to corruption to terrorism risks. This is the new great game.
Yeah, I'm hesitant to call it a gold rush, and it's not quite a gold rush. I don't think that's correct. It's more of everyone assessing their future access to resources, not even current, but just sort of establishing those relationships to really block off almost huge swaths of the earth to have future access to these resources. Because yes, the demand is extremely heavy right now, but it's about to get much heavier. And so thinking 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, having the ability to gain deeper access really will dictate how far your economy can go. A lot of that is really going to be dependent on your access to these resources. And if you're cut off, you're going to be stuck.
Well, no, absolutely. I mean, if you're a tech company and you think that geopolitical risk doesn't affect you, it does in a big way. To just kind of drive home how it plays out, the difference, how local politics plays out with rare earth elements. Just kind of give you a rundown. Like in Myanmar, you have local militias that basically control extraction. And then in Sweden, you have mining that's basically halted indefinitely because of concern over water pollution. And then even in the US, you have along the California-Nevada border, these weird regulations that sort of clash between environmental concerns and taxation, and then defense mandates for defense production that kind of halt and hinder mining along the California-Nevada border. And this just kind of shows you how the local political and regulatory landscape, regardless of where you're at, actually gets pretty thick in terms of trying to access these rocks.
Yeah, really interesting. You started in Myanmar, ended up in Nevada, and honestly, both are extremely complicated in this space to really figure out exactly how the regulations work, how you can safely set up your operations. So it's not as though even if you stay domestically within the United States that it's a smooth path ahead. No matter where you're planning to get involved with the extraction business, you're going to need a significant amount of due diligence. And some of the international organizations, obviously more focused on the humanitarian side, have really focused on not only the rare earth minerals or the critical minerals, but just mining and extraction in general. And there's a lot of guidance out there. I think one of the best pieces of guidance that I've seen is from the OECD. And they really explicitly say that at the end of the day, you've really got to have a boots on the ground approach to understanding what's happening in these locations. And so that's really critical in this space.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And even within a firm itself, you actually have internal firm dynamics that are driven by this stuff. For example, the chairman of an Australian mining company called Northern Minerals had a shareholder coup attempt just recently, last year, that was spearheaded by a state-owned investment fund based in China, Yushao Investment. And, this was totally politically motivated, but it goes right back to the geopolitics and the rare earth elements as well, where these things intersect within a single company. And depending on if you're an investor or maybe you're involved in one of these companies yourself, this stuff's going to come to a head even within your own offices.
Yeah. And look, you don't have to be a geologist to understand the dynamics here. I think an easy way to look at it is follow the technology. Where there's projected technology growth, where there's projected AI integration, there's going to be a higher demand for what we're describing, these rare earth minerals. And so companies that are dependent on acquiring or developing technology to grow also need to understand that to do that access to those minerals is going to be critical. And so thinking 5-10 years down the road, it's not just a case of focusing on your technology product management, but really the different components that you need to have access to basically fuel that technology. And we have a pretty good handle on what we have in front of us today. And I keep going back to it, but the AI is really going to accelerate a lot of the development into places where we're not even sure what the needs will be. I mean, you see that electronic batteries or the EV space gets a lot of press coverage, but we're still just in the early phases of what that technology might look like. So again, it's really looking at how long-term your company will have access to critical minerals.
Yeah. And if you're a company as well, you can actually get very proactive in terms of forming your own internal processes and mechanisms to sort of self-regulate, to not only get ahead of this stuff, but to also try to stave off any retroactive post-crisis regulation that comes out of a government. So for example, Mercedes-Benz, they formed its own internal processes for basically avoiding using minerals associated with human rights violation. And what they did was they set up a monitoring system for all of their suppliers and mineral procurement, going all the way to the smelter, basically, from mining to production. And that was an internal surveillance system that they set up. And companies that want to try to preserve their reputation, make sure that they still have access, or they're partnering with reliable suppliers, those are all things that they can do if they have the right intelligence and due diligence systems put into place. And if you're listening out there, you need that assistance, give us a call. We can help you put it into place.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And as you mentioned, it's really important to make sure that the process you put into place takes that holistic view approach, so you can trace all the way from the initial point of its extraction through the supply chain into your physical plant. It's extremely important. We've seen in certain other industries, retail comes to mind, fast fashion especially, where they've just gotten absolutely hammered from a reputational risk standpoint because they were looking the other way. They chose to just sort of not dive deep into their supply chain to really understand what was going on. And that will really get you into some hot water in this field if you're not looking at how these minerals are coming through the supply chain.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mercedes is a good example where they've demonstrated publicly that they're taking it very seriously and they've got a methodical approach to examining the supply chain in this space. What can companies do, and what are some of the things that you think companies should focus on?
Well, I think it all comes down to looking at your own supply chains. First of all, looking at your own exposure to sort of the race for rare earth elements and assessing whether or not you need to have your own due diligence system put into place, sort of monitor the risks to your exposure to that. So whether or not you're an investment fund, you're invested in technology companies, the rare earth stuff can affect you just because it'll affect the companies in which you invest. And then if you're on the production side, or you are a tech company or a manufacturer, how do you assess the quality and stability of your supply chains? There's ways to do that and sort of replicate what Mercedes did. You'd have to conduct an audit of all of your partners overseas, knowing what components you're reliant on and where, and then kind of monitoring the situation where your suppliers are located to see if that supply could be disrupted. And then if it can be, you need to either try to figure out mechanisms to try to stabilize that if you can, or if not, because it's just out of your control, maybe it's geopolitical, you can look for alternative suppliers in other locales, maybe look for subsidies of different kinds or substitute technologies, or just try to engineer your way around it. But it all comes down to monitoring, having internal processes and training put into place, and then basically extending the awareness of your firm and the intelligence that it has as far down the supply chain as possible, down all the way to the production in the mines. Because that's ultimately that raw material comes to your factory floor, then to your shop floor, and then ultimately to logistics and your customer. Knowing the full spectrum of the movement of your products, what's involved, who is involved, that requires doing due diligence on all your partners, knowing the situation on the ground. It requires having a presence in a lot of these different places, the ability to have that. And it requires maybe developing that capacity on your own or working with a firm like ours at Infortal.
Yeah, it seems complex when you think about the magnitude of what we've been describing here. But as we've said before, again, it starts with making an assessment of where you're at today, what your risk exposure looks like, and then coming up with a plan to manage that risk. Once you start breaking it down and have a better understanding of where you are today, it starts to fall into place. And these types of risks can be managed just like any other types of risks. It's just a case of gaining that initial knowledge and understanding. And that's really, as you mentioned, that's an area that we focus on, is really establishing the risk profile and then coming up with actionable recommendations that you can take to really put your firm in a better place. So hopefully you enjoyed it. Again, you can check out our article over at Corporate Compliance Insights. See you again.
Thank you.